Hi, good afternoon. Took us a while to find the secret door, but we're here. And my role is just briefly to welcome you and explain what we're going to do. My name is Steve Call. I'm the president of the New America Foundation. Thanks very much for taking time to be with us at this lunch hour. A couple of quick housekeeping reminders. Good idea to turn off your noise-making devices if you have them with you. And we are webcasting this event, so there are people with us out there at their desks. So when it comes time to ask questions, please wait for the microphone and identify yourself and try to be succinct. Really delighted to have both Peter and David with us today, and grateful to David for making the time to come over and be part of the event. These are two of the most distinctive independent voices in American journalism and letters today, and it's just a delight to have them both on the podium together. Peter, we've gotten to know at New America over the last year or more since he's been a senior fellow here in a life that also includes an appointment at City University of New York and his role as a columnist for now the Daily Beast, and writing in many other places, including this important recent piece in the New York Review of Books that I'm sure many of you have absorbed. I'll come back to him as he takes the microphone to talk about his new book, and that is what obviously brings us together today. It's on the table outside. I'm going to make sure that we end promptly at 1:30 so that there's time for you to purchase books on your way out and time for Peter to sign them. But let me also introduce David to those of you who may not be able to see in the back that he's up here with us. Very grateful that he came to respond and join the conversation after Peter talks a little bit about where the book came from and what its historical narrative and arguments are about. David has been an op-ed columnist at the New York Times since 2003. He has a book he confessed due today at Random House, which he's going to go turn in at the end of these proceedings. His previous books include the fabulous Bobos in Paradise, really one of the great pieces of sociology, I guess, or journalism, some combination of those things that really changed the way we saw the suburbs. That's now 10 years old. That doesn't seem possible. It seems more recent than that. And also on Paradise Drive, which came out in 2004. You can see, reading his columns, his interest in science and cognition and lots of other things that are going to make this book that he's turning in today, I'm sure, very interesting. I'm not quite sure I know from reading the columns exactly what it's about, but apparently he doesn't either. And of course, he's written for many other places besides the Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, Forbes, and lots of other places. Just to come back to Peter, I would just say about his work, obviously he's had a very active and important career as a foreign policy writer, as an editor. I think he and David share an interest in the American character, its role in the present, the narrative that brought us here, what it portends about America's role in the world now and in the future. I think they share also an approach to their work that is deeply admirable, both, I think, very difficult to categorize, very independent, very thoughtful, and in Peter's case, it's been a real pleasure to watch him develop this work that he's going to present today, because he did it in ways that are much closer to how I think scholarship is meant to be organized. I'm not sure that it always is. Than to journalism. He invited a lot of people into the conversation about the ideas that he was developing in his book. He was incredibly introspective and open and thoughtful as he worked through the history and findings. He presented his work in interim to colleagues around here, and he just made a lot of friends and fans by the combination of seriousness but also a lack of self-seriousness that infused the process in the book, and it's just been a great pleasure to have him here. He's enriched life in New America in many ways, and so looking forward to hearing him talk about the book and also to help him sell some. So, Peter.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's really been I'm so grateful to New America for being allowed to come here. It's such a wonderful home, and you've been such an extraordinary kind of model of somebody who manages to be a good steward of an institution and also be incredibly productive in your own work. It's a little intimidating sometimes. I'm very glad to be speaking about the book, not least of which because it means I'm not speaking about Israel. I wanted to write a book about Iraq, and I wanted to write a book about Iraq for a kind of a simple reason, which was that I felt like I was kind of at a dead end intellectually. I felt like I had kind of hit a wall. I had a certain set of ideas about America's relationship to the world, about, in fact, America itself, that had grown up, I realized, over my entire adult life, starting from when I was in college. And I thought they were pretty good ideas. I was pretty confident about them, passionate about them. And then they turned out to have some very, very major problems, not just theoretical problems, but problems that actually manifested themselves on the ground, in real people's lives, including ultimately and unexpectedly the lives of people really close to me. And I thought, I don't have another line of work. I mean, I don't have something else to do other than to write about, or at least that I want to do, other than to write about politics and foreign policy. That's what I want to do. But the set of intellectual materials from which I'm going to fashion lots of small ideas about the things of the day no longer seem to me to be particularly usable. They don't seem to be working very well. I can't really deploy them. I need to kind of go back and kind of dig a lot deeper to try to figure out some new ideas that then I can take with me to move forward. I guess another way of putting it is I felt like to try to just kind of edge away from the scene of the disaster intellectually would mean actually that I was not really able to go forward in any coherent way. So I wanted to write a book about why about Iraq, but in a somewhat unusual way, because the word Iraq doesn't appear that much in this book, and certainly not until the last part of it. What I ended up was writing a book about success. And the temptations of success, the dangers of success. What I came to believe about Iraq was that the defining divide between people who supported the Iraq War and people who did not support the Iraq War was less which party they were in, or at least even which ideology they claimed to adhere to, and more the degree to which they were a product of the extraordinary, really captivating success that America had had in the post-Cold War age. That there was a really important generational story here about the impact that seeing so much military and economic and ideological success, starting really in the late 1980s with the fall of the Soviet Union, but also with the war in Panama, produced amongst a group of people, many, many people close to me and myself. And I became interested in this idea, this metaphor of Icarus. Icarus has a father, Daedalus. They're trapped on this island in Crete. Daedalus builds wings. He builds a set of contraptions to get them off of the island. Daedalus is not resigned to his fate. Daedalus, in his own way, is quite an ambitious guy himself. He builds a set of wings to get them off of this island. But he recognizes that the wings are human creations. They're fallible. They're finite. They can only work so far. And the problem of the son, Icarus, is he doesn't recognize that they have limits. He tries to take these very, very valuable contraptions, these wings, and push them beyond where they should be able to go. So this book is about three, what I think of as Icarus generations, three sets, communities of foreign policymakers and intellectuals who found themselves in possession of wings, found themselves in possession of some really pretty extraordinarily powerful ideas about how America should relate to the world, ideas that were producing extraordinary success. And because they saw so much success, they began to forget that these wings were actually finite, fallible human creations that were very, very precious and powerful in limited form, but very dangerous if stretched past the breaking point. They were a little bit, I came to believe that foreign policy is a little bit like the stock market. When whole generations emerge that have only seen it go up, they gradually come to believe that they've cracked some kind of code, that they've unlocked some secret, and that things will only continue to go up. And they essentially double down. They lose the sense of limitation that earlier people might have had, and then very, very dangerous things happen. And then the great drama, which I think is a very, very difficult drama to play out in the American context, when optimism is a kind of national religion and we're all supposed to say that we can accomplish anything, is actually try to find an authentically American language for speaking about limits. So I can't really summarize the book very well in this kind of talk, but it has 3 sections. The first is called The Hubris of Reason. It's oddly enough to some degree about my old magazine, The New Republic, and its relationship to World War I. And it culminates really in 1917. It's about Woodrow Wilson and Walter Lippmann and John Dewey, and these group of people who had seen in the first couple of decades of the 20th century this incredible success in American domestic politics. Seeing America at the turn of the 20th century as a place that was likely, that they feared was sliding into a second civil war based on conflicts between selfish power blocks, business versus labor, immigrants versus native-born, urban versus rural. And the progressives had this vision that, in fact, politics didn't have to be about selfish conflicts of power. It could be about law and reason. You could create all these independent commissions with experts that would come up with rules for how society should be governed. And these rules would be so fair and unbiased and objective that they would make politics no longer about people's selfish interests, but really about the things that they had in common. They would make politics not a clash of selfish interests, but in fact a kind of a common effort at adhering to certain rational principles. And this idea worked so well, at least in their mind, that it became the template for the vision that America had at the end of World War I. That America was not simply going to enter into the world and join one of the rival power blocs that had defined European politics for so long. We weren't just going to join with the British and the French in an alliance against Germany. We were in fact going to create a world in which the selfish power blocks no longer were relevant, in which all countries were basically brought together under a set of rules, a world of reason and law, not a world of selfishness and arbitrary power. This was an extraordinarily compelling, heady idea, and a very, very dangerous one, ultimately, because it turned out that world politics could never be like American politics. Politics between Americans was governed by one sovereign, a government that had all the guns. In world politics, that would never be the case. And that, in fact, the world could never be something, foreign policy could never be something ultimately other than a struggle defined by power. The heroes of the book, in many ways, are really the intellectuals who emerge in response to what I call this hubris of reason in the 1930s and 40s. The great realist thinkers, Reinhold Niebuhr, Hans Morgenthau, George Kennan, and the later Walter Lippmann. What Walter Lippmann kind of becomes by the middle of his life. Their argument was really that the progressives had been naive in their view of human nature, that human beings were inherently irrational, they desired power, and particularly on the world stage, where politics was anarchic, there was no overriding sovereign like there was domestically, you had to understand that politics was always going to be about power, and that you were never going to be able to create a world of reason and law, that human beings really just weren't built like that evil was built in to the nature of who we were. And it was that response to the hubris of reason that I think is responsible for, to some degree, for the extraordinary American accomplishment in the middle of the 20th century. The America's role in creating a world, first under Franklin Roosevelt and then under Harry Truman, in which we basically accepted that we would have to be part of a power alliance, in which we accepted that there would be spheres of influence. We accepted that we would have to be deeply engaged in the world, less to remake the world in our image, and more simply to prevent the world from being remade in the image of our enemies. But the story of these figures, in many ways the stories of them kind of cut through the entire book, is a tragic story, because the irony, again, the book is all about how ideas that are good in limited form become dangerous when stretched past their limits. It was this very idea, this very anti-hubristic idea, that in fact politics was about power, that evil could never be eradicated. In fact, that gets taken by the middle of the 1960s, by the intellectual children of Niebuhr and Morgenthau and Kennan and Lippmann, people like John F. Kennedy and McGeorge Bundy and Walt Rostow and Arthur Schlesinger, ultimately becomes the story of Vietnam. That the idea that politics was a struggle of power, that evil would always exist, which was originally a defensive idea, formed in response, of course, to dealing with the Nazis and Stalin's Soviet Union, becomes by 1965 this global crusade, the idea that you're going to search the whole world for Hitlers to destroy. Containment, which starts basically as this very limited regional doctrine. It's mostly non-military. It's only based on rebuilding Western Europe so it can be strong enough not to fall to internal communist threat. Becomes by the 1960s this global doctrine in which you're trying to stop any communist movement from taking power anywhere in the world. And Morgenthau and Lippmann and Niebuhr all die in some ways in the 1970s in despair, having seen their very own ideas, like Daedalus, their own contraptions basically brought to the point of disaster. That section is called the hubris of toughness. Toughness being this idea that the world will always be a struggle, that human beings, that you can never eradicate sin and evil from human beings, that there's a little bit of Hitler in us all. The last section of the book is called the Hubris of Dominance. And this is really the story that I felt like I witnessed in my own life. To some degree, it's about the way in which neoconservatism turned into its exact opposite. You know, the neoconservatives of the 1970s, and David knows this particularly well and has written about it, and I particularly write about Irving Kristol and Jeane Kirkpatrick. What defined them intellectually more than anything else was their anti-utopianism. They fundamentally believed that any time you tried to make radical progress through government policy, you actually ended up making things much, much worse. The thing they came to hate about the left, first the old left of the Stalinists, and then the new left of kind of the student radicals of America, was their belief that these people were utopians. They had an overly optimistic view of human nature, and therefore they believed that you could radically remake society, destroying the kind of organic foundations of what society was, based on the idea that people were much better than the institutions that governed them. And in fact, what you turned out was, rather than liberating people to be much better, you liberated the barbarism in people. That was the basic idea that really animated a lot of Jeane Kirkpatrick and Irving Kristol. But a very bizarre thing happened to neoconservatism. And that bizarre thing to conservatism in general, that really, really bizarre thing was Ronald Reagan. Because Ronald Reagan, although in a sense the most conservative president America had since the 1920s, was temperamentally one of the least conservative presidents America's ever had. John Patrick Diggins calls Ronald Reagan in his book an Emersonian liberal, because in fact Reagan had this radically optimistic view of human nature. He in fact was a great believer in the possibility of radical progress. He used to say, and he used to drive George Will crazy, he used to quote Thomas Paine, that radical thinker, saying that we have it in our power to begin the world again. So it was Reagan's recognition, in fact, that radical progress, a radically better world, was possible, that I think allowed him to see, when most conservatives could not, the possibility of ending the Cold War, the possibility of a dramatic change in a very short period of time with Mikhail Gorbachev. But it was the same, but this template that Reagan created in 1989 with the fall of the Soviet Union, which was very, very valuable in moderation, became, over the course of the post-Cold War, more and more dangerous. This basic idea, this template of 1989, the idea that America essentially could quickly overthrow dictatorial regimes, help to overthrow them, and produce democracies that were kind of lying in this kind of cocoon form, ready to break out from underneath them. And so it was the incredible ideological success of the rise of democracy in Eastern Europe and in East Asia and other places, followed by the incredible military success that America started to have in the 1990s. Panama, Reagan was too afraid to invade Panama. Panama to Reagan in 1988 still seemed like a terribly, terribly frightening thing to do. But gradually, America had more and more military success. Panama, the Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, such that by the time 9/11 hit, there was much, much, much greater self-confidence in American military power. And also much, much greater self-confidence that America had virtually limitless economic resources because of the economic boom of the 1990s. So just as in a way, the Kennedy and Johnson Camelot group thought that they were replaying the story of 1938 against Hitler in Vietnam, when in fact they were taking an idea, and stretching it past the breaking point. In many ways, I think many of the people who supported the Iraq War saw the Iraq War as their version of 1989, their version of basically overthrowing a dictatorship and bringing about a pro-Western democracy, not realizing that in fact they had taken some these ideas that had worked in limited form and stretched them way beyond the breaking point. Let me just end by saying something about what I think all of this means, if anything, for Barack Obama. I think for me, the most important way to try to understand Barack Obama's foreign policy doesn't really have very much to do with who Barack Obama is. It has to do with the moment in which he's taken power. And the moment in which he's taken power is the moment after the collapse of a hubris bubble. An overestimation of the degree of American power and wisdom to remake the world. And a president who, just as he took office in the wake of a stock market crash, the collapse of a stock market bubble, is essentially taking office in the wake of a hubris foreign policy bubble. And that the fundamental drama of Obama foreign policy will be the drama of what Walter Lippmann called solvency. Walter Lippmann said a nation's foreign policy, like its finances, must be solvent, which is to say, just like you can't have more bills than you have more money in the bank, you can't have more commitments overseas than you had power. That we can now see that the military expeditions of the Bush era were based on a dramatic overestimation of American military, economic, and ideological power, such that we now have essentially we were like a homeowner whose house is only worth $500,000, and we were told it's worth $1 million, and then we were borrowing against the value of the home. That the drama of Barack Obama, whether it's getting out of Iraq, whether it's defining victory down in Afghanistan, whether it's coming to a somewhat different relationship with Chinese power, or whether in fact it's ultimately, if it comes to that, and I hope it doesn't, but it may, coming to have to live with an Iranian nuclear weapon, is ultimately, I think, going to be the drama of coming to terms with the fact that we have to reduce our commitments to bring it in line with our power, which is not as great as we thought it was in the Bush era. And that is incredibly perilous politically. Nobody likes the guy who comes along and tells you that your house that you thought was worth $1 million is only worth $500,000. The last president who went through this solvency struggle, I think, were really Nixon and Kissinger on the one hand, and then Carter. And both of them, in some ways, were crushed politically by the experience. I think Obama's best chance is to try to tell a different story about American power than the story that we have been told in recent years. The story that Americans have become accustomed to hearing about the story of America's success in the 20th century is basically the story of America's military rise. Our military victory in World War II, then the Cold War described as a kind of military victory against the Soviet Union. For Obama to convince Americans that we can in fact become stronger even as we retrench somewhat militarily, I think he has to tell a different story about what happened in the 20th century, which is to say that American success in the 20th century was fundamentally about the success of American economic power. We really won World War II not because our generals were smarter or our soldiers were braver, but because by 1943 and 1944, our factories were simply just massively outproducing the Germans and the Japanese. the Cold War never really fundamentally came down to a clash of arms. We didn't beat the Soviet Union militarily. We really beat them in a struggle of economic systems. And that the next great American challenge will really probably be less the military conflict against jihadist terrorism and more the same kind of struggle that ultimately we faced against first fascism and then against communism, which is the struggle of economic and political systems. Those struggles were in many ways a bet about whether our version of democratic capitalism could be more humane, dynamic, and stable than their versions of authoritarian or totalitarianism, capitalism, and communism. And I think ultimately that's the drama that we are in today. And I think by trying to recast the history of American foreign policy, Barack Obama can explain why we can in fact grow stronger as a country even as our military footprint around the world diminishes a little bit. I think that's ultimately the best opportunity for him not to fall prey to the Icarus Syndrome. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, a neoliberal is someone who's been mugged by Ahmed Chalabi. Turns out. I'm going to criticize Peter a little for overlearning the lessons of Iraq, for the hubris of anti-hubris. But I should say Peter and I are friends, so I won't be rough about it. I was at Peter invited my wife and I over to dinner on the day his wife was expecting a baby, which is a sign that he doesn't have enough wisdom to really be trusted on anything. And we were such boring guests, they actually went to the hospital to get out of it. So we are friends, and I think the world of Peter. And I'm terribly sorry that there was a ship a couple days ago taking a stack of New York Review of Books over to Israel. And the Israelis intercepted it. I'm sorry that happened. And this is a book about a God that failed. And it really is a book about Iraq and wisdom and emotional reaction learned from Iraq. And it's Peter's course is a course I've gone through, I think, a very similar way. And come out in slightly different areas, but in many ways, many of the same traumas, many of the same re-examinations, many of the same thoughts. And one of the thoughts is actually in the mode of this book. This book is a series of stories. It's a stories about different episodes in American foreign policy. And one of the things I really became convinced of is that the power of context over abstract ideas. There's a psychologist, Jerome Bruner, who says there are two ways of thinking. There's the narrative mode and the paradigmatic mode. And the paradigmatic mode is argument, abstract argument, what we're used to doing in buildings like this one. But the narrative mode is much more complicated and much more nuanced and much more reliable because it captures the nature of relationships and it emphasizes not abstract reason but the power of context. And so I was very taken with the idea that Peter used the narrative mode to try to explain his thinking, which I think is the right mode. I also learned a bunch of things from the book, even about the Bush era, which I followed closely. Apparently, after 9/11, Bush said, "We should see this as an opportunity to do stuff." And I've learned that whenever a president says we should see this as an opportunity, it's time to grab your wallet because it means they're ignoring the context. They're just going to do what they wanted to do anyway. But I do have differences. Peter mentions the Persian invasion of Greece in classical times. And the big difference between us is he sees us as Persia, the over-exuberant empire. I always see us as Athens, as the democratic country and the power of ideas. And I do think those ideas, which I'm going to stress a little, are something that Peter shortchanges. Now, the first question to be asked, and I'm going to focus on Iraq, is how broadly should we learn the lessons of what happened? It could be what happened or the trauma of Iraq was not any big intellectual thing. It was America being itself. We embark on a war, and as in probably every single war we've ever fought, we do it really badly for the first 3 or 4 years. We happen to have a foreign policy or a defense secretary who didn't believe in the mission, who had a cockeyed view of a light footprint. We had a military that wasn't prepared for an insurgency. And then after a few years, Petraeus comes in, we learn more about Iraq, we adapt, and we figure it out. And maybe it was just that. And maybe Iraq will, over the long course of history benefit from what happened. They'll have a burgeoning democracy, and maybe it was just poor execution. There's no broad lesson. I don't quite buy that, but I think it's worth raising. The second is maybe what happened in Iraq is simply an indictment of political science and political science thinking. I used to go in and have interviews with Bush officials off the record, and I asked one of the senior officials, didn't you guys get the culture of Iraq wrong? And I can't tell you who it was, but she said, you know, I don't really believe in culture. I believe in institutions. You change the institutions of society, you'll change the society. And that's actually the right political science answer. It's not the answer I believe in. The World Values Survey came in after we were in Iraq and did a survey of the Iraqis. And they asked them, as they asked everybody around the world, would you mind if a foreigner moved next door? This is a question they ask everybody in the U.S. 9% of Americans say they would mind if a foreigner moved next door. Globally, the global average is 16%. In Iraq, it was 91%. And that's because a traumatized nation tends to be a xenophobic nation. And maybe it would have been useful to know that before we went in. And so maybe it's just an indictment of a lack of awareness of culture, and we should be better anthropologists. In which case, Peter and I don't have to think more broadly. I think we're naturally anthropologists, and we can just blame it on Philistinism in the Bush administration. But again, I would go a little broader. And to me, the crux of the issue, and this is, I'm going to phrase a lot of things Peter did in a slightly different way, is a debate. And I'll call it a debate between Jefferson and Oakeshott. Jefferson, of course, is someone you know, but I'm using him as a symptom just because he wrote the Declaration as the emblem of the American ideal. And I think Peter shortchanges the power of the American ideal in driving who we are, whether we want to or not. People or Europeans came to this country in the 16th century, and they saw vast forests before them. They saw flocks of geese that were so big it took them 45 minutes to take off, and they would actually shoot cannon into the flocks of geese just to see if they could get them to change direction. And they saw this incredible abundance, and they had two thoughts. First, that God's plan for humanity could be completed here, and second, that they could get really rich while it happened. And this has created a moral materialism that is endemic to who we are, that makes us more religious than most other industrialized nations, that makes us and always has made us more energetic and much more idealistic. And this is what explains American exceptionalism. I'd love to hear Peter's reaction to Robert Kagan's book, Dangerous Nation, which is the history of American foreign policy really as an emblem of this sort of idealism, as a country which has always, since the very beginning, thought to promote democracy in the world because we believe in certain propositions. And that is simply just who we are. And by the way, that creed worked out pretty well in the 20th century. Not only did it win the Cold War, there were 10 democracies in 1910. There were about 120, 130 today. And it was partly because of this creed of democracy. And I would say we didn't win the Cold War simply because we were materially advanced, or World War II for that matter, but it was the power of ideas that had a tremendously important role in that victory. And so those ideas are one half of the debate over how we should conduct our foreign policy, that people are born with inalienable rights, and that where they don't have those rights, bad things are bound to happen, like terrorism. And that, I think, was what propelled maybe Peter, but certainly me, and I think a lot of people in the Bush administration, to believe in the war in Iraq. Now, the second half of that debate, and opposing what I'm going to call Jefferson, is Oakeshott, the British philosopher. Now, Oakeshott I hold up as an emblem of a phrase which is near and dear to me. The phrase is epistemological modesty. And that is the idea that the world is phenomenally complex and we should really be aware of what we don't know. We don't know much about ourselves and what is driving us. Just two quick examples. This is actually from my book, but people named Dennis are disproportionately likely to become dentists. People named Lawrence are disproportionately likely to become lawyers because unconsciously we prefer things that are familiar. That's why my own son is named President of the United States Brooks. And all women like to date men who are slightly taller than themselves, though a guy who is 5'6" can get as many online date offers as a guy who's 6 foot, so long as he makes $172,000 a year more. But that's just, these are little symptoms of that we are very complicated. A lot of things are happening within us, and we are strangers to ourselves. And if we are strangers to ourselves and our true motivations, we are certainly strangers to each other. It's like playing chess with a bunch of chess pieces, all of whom have their own minds. The world is much too complex to think you can impose your will upon, and therefore you should be extremely cautious and modest. And Oakeshott has a famous passage where he says, politics is not about changing the world, it's just about steering a ship and trying not to make it capsize. The sea has blown it apart, all you want to do is keep it level. And that is a very modest and cautious way of doing politics. And that is the fundamental debate between the idealism that I think is endemic to us and the caution, the epistemological modesty, which I think is the source of wisdom. And to me, there is no solution to that debate. You have to contain both sides. And I think Peter is overlearning the lessons of Iraq and emphasizing the modesty and shortchanging the idealism and the power of the ideas. One, because it's in us. We have no choice about that matter. We wouldn't be Americans. Two, because when you abandon those ideas, you find yourself trying to play chess with the world. And that is simply too complicated. That's another form of hubris. Instead of sticking to the same basic principles to guide your foreign policy, you're left rudderless, and you try to devise new principles based on some rationalistic conception of the world, and you try to play chess in a very realistic way, in what you think of as a pragmatic way. But as Chesterton said, the problem with pragmatism is that it doesn't work. This to me is a challenge which we will never get rid of, the challenge between the idealism of Jefferson and the wisdom of Oakeshott. And so how do you negotiate your way through this? Well, it seems to me Jefferson for Americans always comes first, but you have to balance it with the modesty of Oakeshott. And people who I think did that very well, and my take on Niebuhr might be a little different. One of them is Reinhold Niebuhr. Because Niebuhr said, you have to use power even as you know it corrupts you. But you still have to use it. And you have to be aware that even as you use power, you will estimate your own motivations too highly, and you'll underestimate the motivations of your opponents. But you still have to use it. And Niebuhr was a cold warrior, after all. And second, and this is the sort of the pseudo-ancestor of Oakeshott, is Edmund Burke. And Burke was a champion of the American Revolution because he believed in these ideas, which he thought were not only good ideas, but God's ideas. But he made a distinction between change and reform. And change is when you try to change a society. Reform is when you try to repair it and bring out its elemental nature. And Burke said you should try to repair society and do government with the reverence of one who is operating on your own father. That is to say, you shouldn't try to change everything, but you should still try to bring out the essential healthiness of a society. And so as Americans, I think we don't have a choice. We're always going to be negotiating these two opposing tendencies, our idealism of our souls and the caution and wisdom of our experience. And I think if we go too far in the other direction and abandon that idealism for a sort of excessive modesty, the world will be without a great champion. We will end up rudderless, and we, in the end, won't even recognize ourselves. Thank you.
So just to keep the conversation up here for a few minutes before we turn to the audience, obviously the first question, Peter, is just to ask you to reply to some of David's thoughts, and particularly to his emphasis on the role of ideas in the narrative that you relied upon, talking about the Second World War and the Cold War and so forth.
Yeah, should I just stay down here?
It seems easy.
I guess I don't see my book as being an attack on idealism. What I would suggest is that the force of arms is not the best vehicle for the idealistic impulse. And I think that one of the problems to some degree with the way in which foreign policy debates tended to get thought about in the Bush era was that the vehicle for American idealism was too much thought about in terms of military force, which is a very, very, I mean, of all the corrupting and dangerous and difficult to wield tools, I think it is the most difficult of all. So you know, to go back to Jefferson, first of all, there's the idealism of the effort to perfect American democracy at home. And the very, very long and powerful tradition of people who have believed that, in fact, it is that struggle that can be an inspiration to the world, an inspiration to people seeking democracy and justice and liberty in their own countries. And there is often a tension, I think a tension that was not recognized perhaps enough in the Bush era, between the idealism of trying to use military force to bring American ideals to other people, and the impact that in fact ended up having on American ideals at home. So I think that first of all, there is an idealism about the domestic struggle for American democracy. There are also other ways besides military force to try to bring American ideals. I mean, historically, one of the forces for American ideals has been commerce. It's been the idea that we bring other nations into trading relationships, and in that way break down. In many ways, this was very central to Ronald Reagan's idea. I mean, Reagan and Schwartz were essentially trying to teach Gorbachev that in an increasingly globalized world, the Soviet Union couldn't simply be a closed society anymore. So that was the idealism of American commerce is also, it seems to me, a very important vehicle for American idealism. So I think it would be a mistake to. So if I'm suggesting a kind of modesty, I would say the modesty should be greatest when it comes to using military force. And I think America's more successful military ventures, even if they have had an impact in terms of spreading democracy, have really fundamentally been defensive. And that's partly because even though we are a deeply idealistic nation, we are also not, in fact, a nation by and large that is willing to lose a lot of blood and treasure purely in support of promoting freedom around the world. Unless our military ventures start with some genuine basis in a threat to the United States, we turn out, as Walter Russell Mead said in his book Special Providence, to be like a car that has elites at the wheel, that in fact where the engine, which is the American people who are willing to die and spend money, in fact runs out of gas. And for me, and in that way, it's important to remember that we never would have been able to launch a ground war in Iraq had it not been justified fundamentally as an effort at American security. And when it turned out that that rationale was much weaker than many of us had thought, I think the whole project became very problematic, because we never, in fact, would have launched a ground war in Iraq simply based on freeing the Iraqis. One of the things that became more clear to me as I was thinking about the foreign policy of the 1990s in writing this book was then you look at America's actions in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Kosovo. One of the reasons those ventures were successful was that they were ventures of very, very low cost to the American people, that we were able to actually do some good in preventing genocide. But the contract with the American people was necessarily one in which Americans would lose very, very few lives. And I think one only has to imagine what would have happened if we'd gone into Kosovo on the ground. I consider the Kosovo War to be a great accomplishment, something that had a huge impact on me in terms of making me more hawkish. But one only has to think about what would have happened practically had America had to go in on the ground in Kosovo and started to lose a significant number of lives to see, in fact, that the whole thing would have unraveled. So while I agree with David and with Bob Kagan that there is this deep missionary impulse in the American character, I also think that one has to remember that when it comes to Americans actually losing lives and losing fortunes purely for this missionary effort, not connected at a very basic level to threats to American security. In fact, we tend to basically write checks that we don't cash. We tend to basically give up, actually, pretty quickly, often not leaving the societies that we've been engaged in a very good place.
Well, so let me ask a question that I was thinking about listening to both of you, which is about the antecedents of your project, that is, the lessons of Iraq. And the question that I was thinking about is, what do we think we know about why the decision to invade Iraq was actually made? I mean, there were many rationales offered. You as an individual know what you thought.
Yeah.
We know what was argued about. But looking back on it now, it's not really clear what exactly drove the decision. We know what drove the explanation of the decision: weapons of mass destruction, security arguments, and so forth. What do you believe? And in your book, you're saying it's an overestimation of American military capability. Yeah. But what do you think was the decision that represented hubris in that?
I guess I would say a couple of things. I tried to write about this a bit in my book and tried to think it through. Maybe David may have other thoughts. I think, first of all, it's important to remember that that we would never have invaded Iraq had the war in Afghanistan, I think, not initially seemed to turn out well. That in fact there was a lot more anxiety about initially even going into Afghanistan than I think we quite remember now. But it was essentially the apparent success that we had in Afghanistan that led, I think, in this kind of ladder-like way, for Americans to become more and more and more willing to double down in the belief that our military power would always succeed. I think the war in Iraq came about because of an exaggerated sense of fear. That fear was, of course, the result of 9/11 and to some degree a result of the anthrax attacks as well. But I think one of the things that's come through to me in the book, both in thinking about Iraq but also about thinking about Vietnam, is the relationship between power and fear, which is to say, the more power you have, the more willingness you, in a sense, are willing to be afraid of things because you think you can do something about them. If you have a hammer, you're more willing to find nails. Or as Robert Kagan said in one of his analogies, a guy with a gun is more willing, a guy with a knife may pretend that the bear doesn't exist, but the guy with a gun is more willing to confront them. So what I'm trying to say is the exaggerated sense of fear I think that we had about Saddam's WMD arsenal. Remember, we were a country that lived with with Mao's nuclear weapons and with Stalin's nuclear weapons. The exaggerated sense of fear we had about the threat represented by Saddam's chemical and biological weapons and perhaps nuclear program was a product, in large measure, of the extraordinary self-confidence we had developed in American military power, exaggerated self-confidence we had developed in American military power, and in the limitlessness of American economic resources, and to some degree in the universality of the American political model.
David, do you agree with that assessment of where the decision came from? Obviously, everybody in the cabinet, the war cabinet, who voted yes at the last, as the decision developed, had their own blend of thinking and analysis. But does Peter's description of where it came from sound right to you?
Well, I think for different people, there were different people with different views. I mean, for Dick Cheney, I think it was a view that the things we had tolerated in the past, we can no longer tolerate.
It was a demonstration project.
Right. Well, it was because of maybe fear, he would say, increased awareness of threat. We had to adjust what we could tolerate. But I think for the president, I think for most people, it was both. It was the presence of WMDs and the mission to spread democracy, which was not divorced from national interest. It never is. It was the idea that unless over a course of a generation that the Middle East turns into a normal place, we'll be perpetually threatened. So it was. It's never only idealism. Nobody's ever gone to war just because it's charity work. It's always the intermingling of the two, and I think for most of them it was that intermingling.
Well, in this strand of idealism, Peter, I'm not sure if it's in the book, but I was surprised as you walked through your narrative that you didn't talk about Kosovo and Sierra Leone and the duty to defend and Blair's vision of liberal internationalism and the Chicago speech. I thought that was the idea that had been overbuilt in Iraq, in your estimation.
Yeah. Well, I guess I try in the last section of the book, I try to tell essentially kind of two parallel stories about the rise of neoconservative foreign policy as neoconservatism becoming its opposite, and also liberalism moving from its very chastened kind of post-Vietnam phase to this liberal hawkishness that emerges over the course of the 1990s, which was more my story. And I think that's, you're exactly right. Those things were very, you can say that lots of Democratic politicians just supported the Iraq War because they were afraid politically of getting beaten up by Karl Rove. But intellectually, I think there was something genuine that happened over the course of the 1990s for liberals, and it was a belief partly that it was partly the collapse of any prestige of America's enemies. There was always a certain, I think, amongst liberals, a certain confused ambivalence when America was fighting foes of the left. Not that mainstream liberals liked Castro or Ho Chi Minh, but there was some sense that perhaps those were the best that those societies could do. That there was a sense that perhaps you needed left-wing authoritarian or totalitarian regimes to produce some kind of economic development, and then only later would you have freedom. I think the experience of 1989 and of the dramatic embrace of democracy throughout the world, throughout the developing world, including in Eastern Europe, made and then the resurgence of kind of fascistic, ultranationalist movements in places like Rwanda and in the Balkans led liberals to have an increased self-confidence in the moral clarity of a struggle between America on the one hand and these enemies on the other, and that was combined with the sense that liberals, I think liberals, the sense that liberals realized over the course of the 1990s that the American military was a more competent institution than they had thought. I mean, American liberals had come of age during Vietnam when they thought that the military wasn't really good at doing anything other than creating disasters. But liberals, having been wrong by and large in predicting disaster in Panama and then in the Gulf, by the time of Bosnia in 1995, a lot of liberals thought, gosh, well, the military is so successful in protecting our oil supplies. Maybe we should be using the military to do things we really care about, like preventing genocide. So I think that story is really important, but I try to tell it a story as a ladder of escalating risk, which is to say, people thought, and this is a theme in the book, the way in which the danger of analogizing, people think they're simply doing the same thing that was done before, when in fact what they're doing is doubling down. So that the ground wars in Afghanistan and certainly Iraq were much, much riskier endeavors than the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, which were air wars, where very, very few American lives were put on the line. And I think it's that distinction that I think I and some others perhaps didn't sufficiently acknowledge.
Can I defend early Beinart for a
Yes.
second? I mean, I think it's quite possible to draw a narrative that the outcomes of the war in Iraq vindicates your first book or earlier book. Simply be saying the Bush administration foolishly tried to do regime change without nation building. And if there's one thing the liberal internationalists knew about, which some neoconservatives knew about, was you had to do nation building. You had to send enough troops. You had to do what has turned into the Coin Doctrine, which real counterinsurgency, real nation building, village by village. And if you do that, Iraq might have worked out entirely different. If we'd done that from the start, Afghanistan may look entirely different, in which case it's not an indictment of your view. It's a vindication of Moynihan's great phrase that the central conservative truth is that culture matters most, and the central liberal truth is that government can change culture. And if we'd done it right, it would have worked out a lot better than it did, and you don't need to re-examine everything A to Z.
Well, but David, just to square the circle in your own intellectual history around this, because reading you today attentively, your epistemological modesty comes through in every other column, especially when you write about the Obama administration and government in the world we're in now. Take us back. Were you a liberal internationalist in Weekly Standard clothing in the late 90s? Did you believe in the potential of nation building? Has your own emphasis on epistemological modesty been influenced by the Iraq War in any meaningful way or not?
Yeah, no, clearly I wrote a column before the war saying a version of the talk I just gave where I said it's Oakeshott versus Jefferson, but Oakeshott, we can set him aside for a few months. I got swept up, I think, in the fervor, in the 9/11 fervor, the fear, and I put too much faith in the Bush administration to be aware of this. Or at least Donald Rumsfeld to be aware of it. So for me, post-Iraq, the main thing is to reemphasize what I should have known all along, that modesty. 2, to really pay much more attention to culture and really have a much more cultural approach to all political issues. And 3, generally to be much more modest. But I wouldn't want to throw out the whole ideology the whole belief.
But you seem open to the claims of counterinsurgency as a mechanism to control complexity in faraway societies.
Because if you believe in bottom-up change and cultural change, what counterinsurgency is an attempt to do is to create that gradually over the long term with massive investment over generation. Mm-hmm. And that, by the way, was the original plan for a lot of us in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And so I think Petraeus and others have stumbled upon a belief in change, which, by the way, would have been very congenial to the 1970s neoconservatives in the public interest, which was not about top-down technocratic change. It was a rejection of that. It was in favor of cultural, moral, mental change from the ground up. And so, you know, I think the idea that we can engage in wars like Afghanistan, we might as well take cases using the Coin Doctrine. That's the way to go, and I think that's where Obama is.
Are you there, Peter, after your period of introspection, or have you come out some other place about Coin in Afghanistan?
I mean, I agree with David that what is impressive about the way Coin emerged in Iraq is that it was based on a much deeper bottom-up understanding of what was actually happening in Iraq, and also a certain kind of modesty in the recognition that, frankly, we were basically going to have to buy off a lot of our enemies rather than actually defeating them. That I think one of the, for me, you know, basic wisdom in foreign policy is if you have a more modest understanding of your power, you don't try to take on all your enemies at once. You try to divide your enemies and limit the number of enemies you have. That the Cold War containment was most successful when we weren't trying to fight communism writ large, but when we were in fact allying with certain communists, like allying with the Yugoslavs against Stalin, or allying with the Chinese, which we did in the 1970s and 80s against the Soviet Union. So the effort to try to split the insurgency in Iraq based on the recognition that we couldn't define it so broad, we couldn't defeat everybody. I think the Sunni, the Baathists, the Islamists, the jihadists at the same time, was wise. But I still think one has to step back and say, even though we've learned a lot of very, very important lessons in Iraq and now are applying them to Afghanistan, given what we now know about the larger global situation that the United States is in, is this the way in which we would have decided to use this vast, vast, vast amount of American resources, this extraordinarily this vast amount of American energy, kind of energy of our top policymakers who haven't been able to really focus as much on other things because they only have 24 hours in the day. And I think, to me, the answer, in general, I would say is no. That the larger, more important fundamental struggle is really, you know, just in the way that we could have potentially, had we stayed in Vietnam and continued to learn the lessons better, maybe ultimately saved South Vietnam. The question would have been, at what broader cost to American power and position in the world? That ultimately, what was more important was being able to essentially rebuild the United States so the United States could compete in the larger, broader drama of our struggle against the Soviet Union. And what I fear now is that our emerging kind of struggles, economic struggles, competition against China, against India, against a whole range of power, is essentially, our position is weakening because we're focusing so overwhelmingly on a series of conflicts that are preventing us from being able to turn our attention and husband our resources for those competitions that look much, much, much more challenging, I think, than many of us realized a few years ago. That wars that basically, even if we can fight these wars better than we thought, wars that that push us further and further into debt, are ultimately not necessarily wars that are going to make us stronger.
Great. So some questions from the audience there in the back.
Hi, Zachary Davis from the Carnegie Endowment. I have two questions. One is, there is, in the run-up to the Iraq War, there was a great appeal in the idea that we would no longer be hypocrites by embracing autocratic regimes, and that we would treat all regimes fairly and idealistically. And as Obama has backed away from that, there's this tension between how we should treat Egypt as opposed to other kinds of autocrats, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. And the second is, Peter, your thought about the idea that yes, we could have won Vietnam, but at what cost? It seems to me that proponents of a very hubristic military foreign policy have a more emotional commitment to the idea of honor and are thus willing to spend whatever it takes to win a war. And it seems like there's this very emotional commitment to winning a war at any cost, and I wonder how that factors into our decision making.
Great. I'd love to hear David on that second question too. So, Peter.
I guess I would just say on the human rights point, I really think that too much of our discussion about human rights focuses on rhetoric rather than on what actually happens. You know, I mean, the Bush administration is continually described as idealistic because Bush gave these very powerful speeches. But when I look around on the ground at the great, you know, and maybe Iraq will turn out to be an exception to this, but when I look around on the ground at the fate of human rights in the Bush administration, and I'm not even talking about the fate of human rights in the United States, which I think was its own very important question, I actually don't see the great successes that people talk about. So that when people say that Barack Obama is retreating, it seems to me what they're often talking about is that he's retreating in a certain sense rhetorically. Now, retreating rhetorically can have its costs, but I think we should remember that and conservatives, I think in particular, again, the older kind of conservatives that David reveres, will particularly understand the difference between, you know, a kind of between simply saying things that make you feel virtuous and actually accomplishing things that actually help people around the world. Now, there may be cases, there certainly are cases in which thunderous denunciations are absolutely the best way to go, but not always the best way to go. There are other cases, in fact, in which a quieter effort to try to support people on the ground in various ways, but keep our face off of it, might in fact be the thing that in the end, that on the ground will actually be the best for human rights. So I think that our debate, it seems to me, is a little bit simple-minded in that regard often. On this question of honor, I think it's a really important point. But yet, the effort to redeem America's honor at a point in which you're ultimately weakening the nation seems to be counterproductive. And it's important to remember that even if you look at John McCain, you know, the fascinating thing about John McCain was that he was not always John McCain. John McCain, in the wake of Vietnam, you know, we think of John McCain as the guy who, in the name of honor, would have kept fighting the Vietnamese until today. In fact, that was not the John McCain of the 1970s and 1980s. John McCain's foreign policy views in basically for about 20 years after Vietnam, until the middle of the 1990s, were virtually indistinguishable from Colin Powell's. He basically was very, very, very cautious about American military intervention around the world because, like many in the military, he didn't think that the American people basically had the stomach for these kind of deployments. He essentially was, I try to tell the story of McCain as I see it, he in a sense was also the product, in a way, of this post-Cold War success that led him to basically abandon the post-Vietnam modesty he had. And I think Reagan is an interesting figure. I have a piece in Foreign Policy about Reagan, which conservatives will hate because it's an attempt to steal Reagan from them. But I think, for me, what is fascinating about Reagan, who was certainly someone who believed so deeply in honor and the importance of honor, not backing down, was that in the effort to kind of salvage American honor after Vietnam, Reagan did not fight any other Vietnam. In fact, he refused to send American troops to Central America or El Salvador or even Panama, and he withdrew them very quickly in Lebanon. Reagan, for all his talk about honor, all his symbolic efforts to make America feel strong and proud, was very, very, very conscious of, in fact, not trying to win honor at too high a cost. And I think that's an important lesson.
Well, but I thought the questioner intended the word honor, David, in a slightly different sense, which is that nations like people make commitments to allies. When you stand beside an ally, you're not allowed just to get tired and give up on your commitment to them. And the questioner, I don't mean this critically, but the questioner described the military's devotion to honor as an emotional commitment that almost sounded like a neurosis, whereas I think the honor that brought the American public to John McCain was the honor of withstanding torture, not betraying his prison mates, not his foreign policy honor. So in Afghanistan today, certainly American decision-making is influenced in part by the notion that we have a commitment in addition to our interests. what is your sense of where that figures?
I would say it is emotion, and a noble emotion, and a universal emotion. I don't think there's ever been a society on earth where people are praised for running away in battle. We all have a sense, and this is innate to us, that one should stick by one's commitments. And I do think Peter underestimates the extent to which people and regular soldiers fight for honor. James McPherson had a great collection of Civil War letters from soldiers on the front line as they wrote home describing, and these were people who all died, and they had no reason to lie to their wives, but they said, "Why am I here?" And it was all for pretty idealistic reasons. Part, it was the normal stuff, I'm fighting with my buddies, but it was also because they thought their cause was just. And I think this was also the case in World War II. If anybody saw the Pacific, they talk about that even on the TV show. But also in the case of the soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think they fight for national honor as well as to defend their intimate buddies. Now, there's honor and there's honor. If you, again, I can't help with the brain research. If you bump into a northerner on the street and you measure his cortisol levels, a man, it'll go up to here. If you do it in South Carolina, the cortisol levels will shoot up to here. Because honor is a more precious thing in the South than up here in the pusillanimous North. But I guess the final thing to be said is that honor is important, it's universal, it's worth fighting for, but you can't have a debate about the importance of honor when you act in ways that may be dishonorably without getting into specific cases. And say in the case of Afghanistan, the idea that we would leave Afghan women to the power of the Taliban, that would be fundamentally dishonorable, and it should be a real factor in the way we think about whether to fight.
Yes, back on this side.
I was wondering what both of you would think about the fact that we've not had a draft since the Vietnam era, and how that affects the foreign policy in terms of doing things. Basically, even though we empathize with our military, and unlike in Vietnam where we turned against the men and people in uniform, now we sympathize with them and support them. But most Americans do not even have to face the prospect of ever serving. And does that make it easier for us to sometimes either advocate or deal with foreign policy that entails a lot of military action, Iraq, anything else, fighting Al-Qaeda, or anything else for that matter?
Good question. Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's virtually no question that were we to have a draft, we would have a very different foreign policy as regards to military intervention. We would basically not have kind of expeditionary wars. Our military actions would be much more likely to be restricted to basically countries that we felt that there was a really genuine kind of immediate threat to the United States. Now, that one could argue that might make it harder for us to have to be a global power. Imperial powers around historically have basically often had kind of expeditionary forces. The challenge has often been that often those expeditionary forces were not made up of their own citizens. They were made up of people. If you think about the British, when the British were in India, in Iraq, a lot of the British troops in Iraq were Indian troops. They were not in fact from Britain itself. America has a much larger population, but I do think there has been it'll take a long time, I think, for us to really understand the strain on American fabric that has come from basically now having spent a decade or so in which the country has experienced so little sacrifice, and we've basically created this very, very segregated caste of people on whom all of the sacrifice is fallen. Not that those people are necessarily doves. I think David is right that a lot of people in the military have become very attached to the mission in Iraq and Afghanistan and wanting to bring it to a successful conclusion. And yet I think that just as James Fallows wrote, Nick Lemon wrote famously about the experience of the class divide in Vietnam. I think that the divide that we're going to feel culturally from the last 10 years, I think, has still not played itself out.
Yes, in the front row here.
Thanks. I would actually challenge your view of the 20th century, but I'm going to ask you a more important question in terms of foreign policy. More immediately important question to me, which is, you wrote this great article about Israel in the New York Review of Books, and it was very focused on Israel-Palestine. Could you discuss the relationship between the article and the book? Because I think that the American Jewish community is living in another reality where they don't want to address the immediate question. They want to rely on the historical reliability of Israel to the United States and ignore the ways in which the dynamic is now poisonous.
Okay,
for
understood.
us.
Good question.
Well, let me just say something, and I'll say something to Neil David, actually, which is I think David is actually one of the big reasons that I've come to believe that that the Netanyahu government is really in trouble in the United States, and the degree to which the debate has shifted so radically. The New York Times has two conservatives on its op-ed page, both people I think extremely highly of. I find it very significant that neither of them rises to the defense of this Israeli government as past New York Times columnists like William Safire and Abe Rosenthal have. It seems to me a very significant shift in the public debate. I guess the only parallel or interconnection I would see between my book and the New York Review of Books piece has to do with the question of how I think about democracies and non-democracies. I think one of the things that happened for those of us who were creatures of 1989 is that we felt extremely emboldened in drawing a very, very, very bright line morally between democracies on the one hand and non-democracies on the other. And to some degree, I think that was absolutely right, and still is right, that to some degree it was a reaction to too many people, particularly on the left, in the 1970s and 80s, suggesting, well, actually, maybe there's not really that important a moral distinction between the West and the East in the Cold War. Of course there was. Very, very important distinction. Just like there was a very, very important fundamental distinction between today, the United States, and China. And yet, I think what happened was the democracy became a kind of an alibi. And I felt this very much in the Bush era. So what you found was that because we were on the right side of this bright line, we the democracies, they the authoritarian governments, that became a kind of an all-purpose excuse for anything you did, with the idea that because you were a democracy, you were not really capable of grave crimes, of really terrible misdeeds. And I think that's actually a naive understanding of democracy. Democracies are very, very, very precious things, but they're not always liberal, as Fareed Zakaria has written about. And in fact, democracies in war can be, in some ways, just as savage as non-democracy. And it's particularly important because the Israel in the West Bank is not a democracy. And so to use Israeli democracy as an alibi for what Israel does in a territory in which most of the people do not have the right to vote, I think is a very, very dangerous use of this democracy as an alibi. Just as during the Bush administration, I often felt that we were using the fact that we were a democracy as a way of shielding the United States from international, even domestic criticism, at the very time in which our democratic processes were not being particularly well appreciated in the functioning of our foreign policy. So I guess I would say that's one point of intersection, I think, between the book and the article.
David, are you the bellwether that Peter describes, or are you now prepared to rise to the defense of it?
Well, you know, let's talk about yesterday. So my reaction to the boat thing yesterday was that Hamas, the people running Gaza, are truly villainous. That many of the people on that boat were not exactly a bunch of Mother Teresas running around. And therefore I had some sympathy with the Israeli action. Nonetheless, the world is complicated. And even if it's good guys versus bad guys, there are certain things that maybe are counterproductive. And so I thought, this is at least an open question. And maybe Sapphire wouldn't have thought that way, maybe he would have. But I do think, and this goes exactly to what you were just saying, just because you're the good guys and they're the bad guys, which I do believe, doesn't mean you behave in ways that are worse than criminal, they're stupid. And, you know, the first rule of Israeli politics always used to be, don't be a schmuck. And it's, you know, and I've noticed, by the way, I turned on the blogs early this morning just to get a sense of the reaction from people in the Zionist conspiracy that I'm a part of to the raid. And I would say, looking on the Commentary Magazine website, I saw Max Boot had a critical piece. Jeff Goldberg, my good friend, had a very worried little blog post. So I would not say, even among the arch-Zionists, that this is necessarily a fervent reaction of support for what happened. And that's how democracies act. I mean,
right. Timely note to end on. It's 1:30. I promised to get Peter in front of the books. Thank you all very much for coming, and please thank our speakers.
Thank you so much. It's really so